Welcome back, my dear night traveler. I'm glad you found your way here again, back to this quiet corner where the lamps are low, the questions are old, and history unfolds slowly enough to let your breathing settle beside it. Around the Geonic period, roughly the 8th to 11th centuries, Jewish legal authorities were still arguing over something astonishingly intimate: how a woman should count the days around first marital bleeding, when ritual separation ended, and whether one region's custom could be trusted in another. In medieval Spain, one rule might be looser. In Ashkenaz, another stricter. In Babylonia, entire communities could be bound by rules that elsewhere remain more local. It sounds like the sort of dispute that belongs in a courtroom or academy. But in truth, it lived in bedrooms, washrooms, kitchens, and lamplit corners of ordinary homes. And that is where tonight's story begins. If you're settling in for the night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe if this calm little history ritual has become part of your evenings, and leave me your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where these quiet journeys are reaching. Imagine, if you like, an ordinary Jewish woman in Tiberias in the 4th or 5th century. We do not know her name, and that uncertainty matters because so many women of the ancient Jewish world are present to us only as shadows cast by texts written by men. Still, if we frame her carefully as illustrative, we may picture her without pretending to know too much. She bends over a clay lamp on a Friday evening. Olive oil glistens in the shallow bowl. She twists a wick into place with fingers that have already kneaded dough, washed a child, folded cloth, and checked whether the room is ready before darkness falls. She is not performing a grand public ceremony. She is doing something closer to maintenance, order, rhythm, habit. Yet that small flame may tell us more about Jewish women's real lives than many louder events. The world around her was shaped by rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple. Rabbinic sources, especially the Mishnah and later discussions gathered in the Talmuds, preserve an immense amount of legal and ethical reflection about family life, purity, marriage, prayer, property, and household boundaries. They do not present women as equal to men in status, and they often define female life through exemptions, restrictions, and dependency. Women were classically exempted from many positive time-bound commandments. Rabbinic texts also emphasize modesty, hair covering, separation during menstruation, and the household as a woman's expected sphere. A sharp line is often drawn between formal study, coded as male, and practical household observance, more frequently associated with women. And yet, as historians repeatedly warn, rabbinic literature is not a transparent window onto daily life. It is prescriptive, argumentative, selective, and heavily male-authored. Some scholars have pointed out that taking rabbinic texts alone as social reality can mislead us badly. Real women appear more active in documentary and archaeological traces than later rabbinic editors sometimes wish to acknowledge. That caution is part of the story, not an obstacle to it. It tells us that behind the rules was a lived world more complicated than the rules themselves. So what happened behind closed doors in homes like this one? More than stillness, more than silence, more than passive obedience. In the late antique Jewish household, women's labor stood at the junction of food, sexuality, law, and survival. Menstruation and sexual separation were not abstract doctrines but recurring domestic realities. The laws, later known broadly under the heading of niddah, did not simply concern a woman's body in isolation. They shaped sleeping arrangements, bathing, laundering, timing, marital intimacy, and the rhythms of household interaction. Rabbinic development made these laws more elaborate than the biblical text alone. Cloths could be checked, days counted, doubts discussed, expertise claimed. And while male sages recorded the rules, women lived the consequences with a regularity the sages themselves could never fully narrate. That same woman by the lamp probably also handled dough, storage, and timing. Rabbinic Judaism preserves special attention to the separation of dough, to the preparation of food, and to the marking of sacred time in the home. The home had become, after the temple, one of the principal arenas in which sanctity was maintained. That did not make women priests, but it did make their labor indispensable to ordinary Jewish continuity. Sabbaths did not simply arrive when a man said they had arrived. They arrived through preparation, through oil made ready, bread prepared, rooms ordered, bodies regulated, children settled. The household flame was not the whole religion, but it was one of the ways religion became livable. Marriage, too, hovered nearby. The ketubah, the marriage contract, mattered as a financial instrument and a social guarantee. Rabbinic reforms strengthened the written obligations owed to a wife upon widowhood or divorce. Daughters' inheritance rights were limited in a patriarchal structure, especially when sons existed, yet the legal tradition was not perfectly monolithic. Even within rabbinic argument, one finds traces of debate over women's transactional capacity. Some traditions preserved more room for women's independent dealings than later harmonized law might suggest. That does not mean emancipation. It means that family economy and legal identity were under constant negotiation. You can almost see that negotiation in the room itself. The lamp illuminates not just a mother and wife, but a manager of threshold. Is the bread finished? Is the room arranged? Is the household clean enough, quiet enough, orderly enough? Is the body in a state permitted for intimacy, or must the distance be maintained? Are the children asleep? Has the oil been conserved well enough to last the night? The ancient home was not outside history. It was one of history's busiest workshops. And WH. Out of emotion, what of interiority? What of the woman herself, beyond categories like wife, menstruant, daughter, mother? Here the evidence becomes thin and honesty requires that we slow down. Historians cannot simply pour modern feelings into ancient silence. Rabbinic texts preserve very few unmediated female voices. When they do portray women speaking, they often do so through male editorial designs. A woman may appear as a legal problem, a moral example, or a foil in argument. So when we imagine her fatigue, competence, irritation, or quiet pride, we must do so gently. Still, even without claiming her thoughts, we can recognize her centrality. A system that says so much about controlling women is a system admitting, perhaps unwillingly, how consequential women were. The late antique Jewish household was also never as sealed as later fantasy sometimes suggests. Homes touched markets. Servants and slaves could be part of domestic life. Neighbors observed one another. Ritual purity laws shaped social interaction. Marriage connected families and property. If women were urged toward seclusion, an idealized language lived reality was more porous. Social life moved in and out through the doorway just as light did. The lamp then becomes our first clue. It tells us that behind closed doors, Jewish women were not simply hidden. They were maintaining the material conditions under which Jewish life continued from week to week. They made sanctity practical. They converted law into routine. They absorbed the friction between text and body, between command and timing, between ideal and what a real household could actually manage. And if the rabbis often wrote as though public life mattered most, would the public have endured for a single generation without these private negotiations? Historians also remain cautious about regional difference in this era, because the evidence is uneven and often preserved through later editorial traditions. Practices in Roman Palestine were not identical to those in Babylonia, and not every ruling was universally lived. Some developments that later became standard were once contested, local, or still forming. That uncertainty should not frustrate us. It should remind us that tradition had a history. The woman in Tiberias lowers the lamp into place. Outside, streets darken. Inside, a whole moral geography comes into view. Food, sex, purity, kinship, sleep, and the weekly making of sacred time. But centuries later, far from this Galilean room, the same lamplight would fall on stricter calculations, broader communal decrees, and a household world pulled into the orbit of great academies beside the rivers of Babylonia. Now picture a different room, and a different texture of night. This time let the scene be set in Babylonia during the Geonic age, perhaps in the orbit of Sura or Pumbedita, perhaps in a city shaped by long-distance trade, layered languages, and the authority of great rabbinic academies. Our woman may again remain illustrative, because anonymity is often truer than invention. She cups a lamp with her hand to protect its flame from a draft slipping under the door. The oil is different now, the air heavier, the legal world more interconnected. Somewhere beyond her home, scholars answer questions sent from distant communities. But inside this room, law still arrives as laundry, waiting, accounting, and the management of human closeness. The Geonic period is often remembered for the authority of the Geonim, the heads of the Babylonian academies, and for the development of responsa literature, those written answers to questions from Jewish communities spread across a wide world. That matters profoundly for women's history, because responsa and communal ordinances preserve the kinds of everyday conflicts that polished theological literature often hides. Marriage, abandonment, divorce, widowhood, inheritance, sexual access, and communal emergency all pressed themselves into legal correspondence. Women appear in these records not because medieval jurists were suddenly interested in female subjectivity, but because households generated problems the law had to absorb. One of the most striking examples concerns the wife who wanted a divorce, the so-called mordet, a rebellious or resistant wife. In the early medieval East, Babylonian authorities could show greater willingness than many later European communities to let a woman who insisted on divorce receive one with relative speed. By the 7th century, Geonic rulings developed procedures that, whatever their limits, recognized the severe practical dangers of forcing women to remain tied to broken marriages. That does not mean the system became egalitarian, far from it, but it does mean that household crisis pushed legal innovation. Beneath the theory of male control, communities had to contend with women who refused, complained, negotiated, or simply could not continue. What would that mean in the room with the lamp? It means that a woman's private life was not merely private. If a husband disappeared on business, failed to support his wife, abused her, or left her in suspended uncertainty, the matter could travel outward into communal decree and rabbinic response. Some medieval takanot or communal ordinances explicitly tried to reduce suffering in cases of abandonment, extortion, or legal deadlock. Historians rightly note that such measures gave women more protection than strict older law sometimes offered. Yet they also note that ordinances only appear because the problem was real and persistent. Protection and vulnerability arrived together. The lamp also shines on another region of intimate regulation, niddah and related purity laws. Here the Geonic age becomes especially revealing. Earlier rabbinic distinctions continued to harden. Medieval authorities inherited a system already expanded beyond the biblical baseline, and in the Geonic period certain anxieties became more pronounced. Questions about first intercourse, hymeneal blood, and the timing of the 7 clean days were discussed with a technical precision that would shape later medieval practice. Scholars note regional differences. In the land of Israel, some related customs could remain more local or individualized, while in Babylonia restrictions were more likely to be broadly legislated. Later medieval Spain could be more lenient in counting the clean days after certain forms of bleeding, while French and Ashkenazic practice tended toward added weighting. If this sounds like a detail too small for history, that is exactly why it matters. History so often hides in details carried by women's bodies. Our Babylonian household is therefore not merely a site of domestic obedience. It is a site of legal consciousness. Women did not necessarily sit in academies studying Talmudic dialectic, yet they had to know the rules that structured bathing, bleeding, beds, and expectations. Practical literacy in law could spread differently from formal scholarly literacy. Girls were commonly educated for household competence. In some times and places, women approached rabbis with concrete questions, especially on matters that touched the body and the home. Even where the ideological ideal restricted women from advanced learning, the demands of everyday observance required knowledge. And the economy of the home persisted. A lamp costs oil, oil costs money, cloth wears thin, food storage must be maintained. The medieval Jewish woman in Babylonia was imagined in many sources as someone who should remain largely within the home, yet home itself was an economic unit. Spinning, weaving, food preparation, childcare, and the handling of marriage property were not ornamental chores. They were productive labor. The very legal debates about ketubot, dowries, and inheritance reveal how central women were to property transfer and household stability. Dowry was not simply a bridal accessory. It was capital, social leverage, memory, and risk bundled together. There is also something else the lamp helps us see: the distance between ideal seclusion and social reality. Prescriptive texts may speak as though women remained indoors, modestly veiled, confined to a sheltered domestic sphere. But homes were not airtight worlds. Relatives came and went, merchants traveled, servants worked, midwives entered, letters arrived, disputes escaped the threshold. The very need for communal ordinances proves that households were points of friction within a larger social network. Can you feel how different this makes the phrase "behind closed doors"? It does not mean unhistorical. It does not mean invisible in the sense of irrelevant. It means that the archive often catches women sideways at the moment when something inside the house could no longer stay there. A marriage goes wrong, a husband vanishes, a bleeding pattern raises legal uncertainty, a dowry dispute erupts, a widow needs support, a communal leader writes back. Suddenly the quiet room becomes legible. Still, historians debate how far responsa and takenot reflect ordinary practice. Legal texts tend to preserve exceptional cases. They overrepresent conflict. They tell us where things broke, not always what the unremarkable majority did on a calm Tuesday evening. We should therefore resist imagining every household as a miniature courtroom. Most women's lives were likely composed less of spectacular disputes than of repetition: preparing food, monitoring ritual states, caring for children, repairing cloth, negotiating with kin, enduring fatigue, and keeping enough order that the household did not dissolve. Yet repetition is not historical emptiness. Repetition is what civilizations sit upon. A Babylonian woman trims the wick lower. Perhaps the house is finally quiet enough for talk. Perhaps not. Perhaps she's newly married and learning rules that older women convey more practically than any written text could. Perhaps she is already a mother. Perhaps she's waiting for a husband to return from travel. Perhaps she dreads him. Perhaps she misses him. Perhaps she is calculating whether a community that talks so confidently of law will really help if she needs it. We do not know. But we do know that medieval Jewish law on family matters changed because women's lives forced it to change. The lamp, in other words, illuminates governance from below, not state governance, household governance. The law moved because homes demanded it, and among those demands were female refusal, female endurance, female labor, and female vulnerability. Does that not make the domestic interior one of the most political spaces in the medieval Jewish world? By the end of the Geonic Age, the Jewish Mediterranean was increasingly interconnected. Ideas traveled, merchants traveled, marriages stretched across regions, legal customs diverged and circulated. And in one city of Egypt, where documents were saved almost by accident and ordinary paper outlived its owners, the same household light would fall upon a far richer, more human archive than the Geonim could ever have planned. Now we come to one of history's quiet miracles, the Cairo Geniza. Let the scene settle in Fustat, Old Cairo in the 11th or 12th century. This time we can edge closer to a real person, though still with caution. Imagine Wusha the broker, whose life surfaces in Geniza documents, pausing in the evening over a lamp before sorting papers, weighing obligations, and thinking through another transaction. Or if you prefer a less singular scene, imagine a young Jewish woman not famous at all, sitting beside a lamp while older relatives discuss her marriage settlement, a servant clears vessels, and a letter from a traveling male kin lies folded nearby. Whether the woman is Wusha or someone humbler, the room is no longer guesswork alone. In Fustat, scraps survived. The Geniza of the Ben Ezra synagogue preserved an enormous mass of discarded documents: letters, legal deeds, wills, shopping notes, court records, communal lists, business memoranda, and personal papers. Because written Hebrew script papers bearing divine names or simply Jewish textual residue were stored rather than casually thrown away, an archive of daily life accumulated over centuries. For historians of women, this is invaluable. Instead of hearing only prescriptive rabbinic voices, we suddenly catch documentary traces of ordinary women moving through the world. What did Jewish women really do behind closed doors here? The first answer is almost disappointingly practical. They managed life. They managed life at scale. Young women appear as beneficiaries of gifts and wills, as domestic workers and companions, as brides in negotiation, as recipients of charity, and sometimes as laborers whose work mattered to household survival. Women teachers could instruct girls in sewing and spinning, those foundational domestic skills that were also economic skills. Poverty documents show women navigating need, dependence, and communal aid. Legal records show wives pressing claims, households rearranging after divorce or widowhood, and kin networks flexing under pressure. The Geniza also makes it harder to speak lazily of the medieval household as a fixed patriarchal unit. Scholars working on medieval Egypt have emphasized that families could be fluid, unstable, and repeatedly reconfigured by travel, death, remarriage, and divorce. Men were often away for commerce. Children might be redistributed among kin. Marriages formed and fractured. Support came unevenly. In such a world, the closed door of the home did not protect a timeless structure. It contained an improvised one. That matters when we return to our lamp. Lamplight in Fustat fell on paper. It fell on accounts. It fell on letters sent to absent husbands, brothers, fathers, or business partners. It fell on contracts, probably read aloud more often than privately studied, but present nonetheless as objects of consequence. It fell on sewing, on clothing repair, on food preparation, on nursing, and on whispered strategy. A woman behind closed doors in medieval Egypt might not be secluded from history. She might be sitting at the hinge where legal form met bodily necessity. Wusha the broker, perhaps the best-known Geniza businesswoman, reminds us that some women moved well beyond the narrowest model of domesticity. She is remembered in scholarship as a Jewish businesswoman active in 11th century Egypt, associated with brokering and financial dealings. Her case has become famous precisely because it is vivid. But it should not tempt us into the opposite mistake of imagining every Geniza woman as a bold public entrepreneur striding through markets with complete freedom. Exceptional cases survive because they leave paper. Even so, Wusha matters. She proves that the archive preserves Jewish women not only as wives and daughters, but sometimes as economic actors in their own right. And even for less prominent women, business did not begin only in the market square. The medieval home was porous to exchange. Goods were stored, counted, preserved, promised, consumed, and redistributed there. Women's productive labor might include textile work, management of provisions, preparation of food, oversight of servants, or the handling of small-scale household assets. A public economy rested upon private calibration. To know whether a family could survive a bad month, someone had to know what remained in the storeroom, which creditor had been placated, whether a gift could be expected from kin, and how long grain or oil would last. If Chapter 1 gave us ritual order and Chapter 2 legal compression, this chapter gives us paperwork. But paperwork is never only paperwork. A receipt tells us someone paid. A gift deed tells us someone feared future vulnerability. A letter asking after a daughter tells us kinship stretched across distance. A petition shows frustration breaching decorum. A marriage document shows the household under construction. The home also remained a ritual world. The Sabbath still had tea. Arrive, food still had to be prepared. Menstrual regulations still shaped marital life. Bathing, waiting, laundry, and timing remained part of the intimate infrastructure of Jewish domestic observance. Yet the Geniza helps us see something else. Women were not merely ruled by law, they also navigated among legal venues. Scholars have shown that Jewish women in medieval Egypt could at times use Muslim courts or broader legal environments strategically, depending on what relief or leverage was available. That does not mean easy empowerment. It means practical intelligence in a mixed legal world. What would that feel like from inside the house? Perhaps like learning that one language is for prayer, another for the market, another for officials, and another for family grief. Perhaps like knowing that modesty is praised, but mobility sometimes required. Perhaps like being measured against ideals of honor while also being expected to keep the household from collapsing. perhaps like hearing male authorities speak of structure, while your actual life depends on improvisation. Would you call that private life, or would you call it governance in miniature? There is a temptation, when speaking of medieval women under Islam, to swing between two caricatures. One is absolute seclusion, the other is cheerful cosmopolitan freedom. The Geniza permits neither. Some women were poor, constrained, vulnerable, and deeply dependent. Some seemed strikingly mobile or economically active. Many were both constrained and capable at once. A woman may have lacked formal equality and still possessed sharp leverage within kinship networks. She may have been married young and still negotiated forcefully. She may have managed domestic tasks that look humble to us but were the actual machinery of continuity. We should also be honest about what historians still debate. The Geniza archive is rich, but it is not neutral. It reflects literate urban Jewish society unevenly. The documents that survive are often preserved by chance. Dramatic or legally significant moments leave stronger traces than ordinary days. Scholars debate how representative some visible women are, especially those whose business or legal activity generated unusual documentation. Yet even if Wusha is exceptional, the ordinary women surrounding her are not absent. They stand behind marriage settlements, charity lists, apprenticeship arrangements, household accounts, and letters full of worry. There are younger women here too, poised between puberty and marriage, a stage recent historians have studied with great care. Adolescence in medieval Egypt was not named quite as we name it, but it can be reconstructed from the documents. Girls appear as future brides, dependents, workers, and persons around whom relatives negotiated protection, alliance, and obligation. A lamp at night may have been one of the few witnesses to their anxieties. A girl waiting for a first marriage was not merely waiting to disappear into another household. She stood at the threshold of new legal exposure, new ritual expectations, possible dowry transfer, sexual initiation, and the risk that her support network might thin at exactly the moment when she most needed it. Meanwhile, older women, widows, divorcees, mothers, women of means, women in poverty, show up as agents of coping. Some arranged marriages, some pursued claims, some labored, some taught domestic crafts, some survived precariously on charity. Some used literacy through dictated letters or mediated documents even when they were not conventionally learned. The lamplit room in Fustat is crowded with more female history than nearly any earlier Jewish archive offers. And yet the emotional tone remains surprisingly familiar. Weariness, calculation, obligation, a need to make tomorrow possible. That continuity can be more moving than the differences. Across centuries, the household lamp keeps showing us not grand ideology but the pressure of the recurring. If Wusha pauses at her papers, or if our unnamed girl glances toward the door while relatives discuss her future, the flame beside them does not merely decorate the scene. It marks the point where Jewish life became daily fact. Food, law, marriage, money, and care all narrowed into rooms like this one. And if the Geniza finally allows us to hear these rooms rustle with real paper, what does that suggest about the thousands of earlier and later rooms whose paper never survived? But the next chapter will bring us somewhere colder, more dangerous, and in some ways more intimate still. The Jewish households of medieval Northern Europe, where one woman's husband wrote an elegy so detailed that even centuries later we can still see her house lit from within. Now let us move to the Rhineland, into the high medieval world of Ashkenaz, the Jewish communities of Germany and northern France between the era of the Crusades and the disasters that followed. This time we can stand beside a woman whose name is known, Dulcia or Dolce of Worms, who died in 1196 after attackers entered her home. Let us begin just before the violence, while the story is still domestic. She stands in her house with evening coming on. A lamp is lit. Perhaps children move at the edges of the room. Perhaps money owed is being remembered. Perhaps sacred textiles are folded away. Perhaps the poor have already been helped that day. What we know of her comes above all through the memorial words of her husband, Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, and through the documents later preserved around the tragedy. The details are precious because they are specific. Dulcia is one of the most vivid medieval Jewish women known from Ashkenaz. According to the sources, she supported her household financially, engaged in business and moneylending, managed an extensive domestic sphere, cared for the poor, and was remembered as pious and capable. Her husband's elegiac description does not present her as a silent ornament. It presents her as a working center of the home. She is praised for industry, charity, religious devotion, and the making or handling of important textiles. The exact wording and emphasis depend on the edition and translation used, but the broad picture is consistent. Dulcia's value lay not in decorative withdrawal, but in active maintenance of both household and community life. If the late antique chapter showed us prescriptive law, and the Geniza showed us paperwork, Dulcia shows us memorialization. She appears because catastrophe froze her life into language, but her story aligns with broader research on Ashkenazic women. Historians of medieval Jewish family life in Northern Europe have shown that women in Ashkenaz were expected to marry and bear children, yes, but also frequently participated in economic activity. Moneylending was a documented occupation for Jewish women. Household business could be run from the home itself. Women might work with husbands, continue enterprises as widows, or manage portfolios of loans and goods. Domestic and economic spheres overlapped heavily. A front room could also be a credit office. A storeroom could also be an inventory. A Sabbath table could exist only because weekday arithmetic had been done correctly. That overlap matters enormously for the phrase behind closed doors. In medieval Christian imagination, the Jew's house could be feared, watched, resented, or mythologized. In internal Jewish sources, the house was a place of piety, instruction, anxiety, and work. Children were raised there. Mothers supervised early learning and bodily care. Scholars of Ashkenaz have emphasized how much family life must be reconstructed from sources not originally intended to describe it. Responsa, ritual books, pietistic exempla, gravestones, chronicles, ethical materials. These texts were largely written by and for men, and historians are careful to say so. Even the fullest portraits are refracted through male genres. Yet enough evidence remains to see women doing far more than quietly waiting while men inhabited history. Take piety. Women in medieval Ashkenaz played visible roles in household observance. Candle lighting, Sabbath preparation, dietary maintenance, and attention to ritual rhythms made the home a lived religious environment. Studies of medieval practice have shown that women's observance often existed in a space between halakha and custom. Not every habit originated in formal legal ruling. Some practices were local, embodied, or transmitted by women themselves. That is especially important because it restores historical agency without romanticizing it. A woman could be constrained by law and still shape customary religious life. Take labor. Northern European Jewish households were not worlds of leisure. Jewish minorities in Christian lands often faced occupational constraints and opportunities that pushed families into trade, credit, brokerage, pawnbroking, and niche economic roles. Women were part of this. Sometimes they appeared in records concerning loans. Sometimes they handled business in men's absence. Sometimes widowhood thrust them into direct management. Some women also worked in textile production or related domestic crafts. And because much of this activity could be conducted from the home, the boundary between public and private was porous from the start. Take danger. The Ashkenazic home was not merely a place of warmth and order, it was vulnerable to external violence. The massacres of 1096 and later eruptions of anti-Jewish hostility shaped communal memory deeply. The household could become a target. That vulnerability sharpened the moral value placed on sustaining normality. Lighting the Sabbath lamp in such a world was not quaint, it was stubborn. It said the week would be ordered again despite everything. Would you have noticed had you stepped into Dulcia's home, where the business ended and the devotion began? The question is worth lingering over because modern categories fail us here. We like to separate the spiritual from the financial, the maternal from the managerial, the domestic from the public. Medieval households rarely cooperated with such distinctions. Dulcia could be praised for charity and for commercial competence in the same breath because both belonged to the same moral economy. To support a household, aid the poor, sustain a husband's scholarly status, and clothe sacred objects properly were not unrelated tasks. They were different faces of one responsibility, making Jewish life possible under local conditions. We should also address the historical debate directly. Was Dulcia exceptional, or was she simply well documented? Scholars disagree on emphasis. Some hold her up as unusually vivid but broadly representative of the economic and domestic roles elite Ashkenazic women could play. Others warn that memorial literature magnifies virtue, and that catastrophe tends to preserve extraordinary figures rather than average ones. Both cautions are sensible. The safest conclusion is that Dulcia was not every Jewish woman, but neither was she incomprehensible within her world. She was legible to it. The same is true of women's learning. Formal scholarly culture remained male-dominated, and rabbinic elites often restricted women from advanced textual study. Yet learned women did exist, and practical religious literacy among women was essential. In some settings, women knew prayers, customs, ritual timings, and family laws well enough to transmit them. The home was a school of another kind. A mother or older woman teaching a girl how to prepare, count, clean, pray, or observe was participating in cultural transmission, no less real than a man teaching a boy a formal text. There were also women whose lives intersected with Christian labor systems inside the Jewish home itself. Research indicates that Jewish households in medieval Ashkenaz sometimes employed Christian female servants, childminders, or wet nurses. This added layers of intimacy and anxiety because household boundaries were never purely Jewish in practice. The home as a protected interior was, in reality, full of negotiation across religious lines, especially around food, childbirth, nursing, and service. Still, for all this complexity, the emotional symbol remains the lamp. Dulcia's lamp is not only ritual. It illuminates balance sheets, thread, children's faces, visiting poor, perhaps letters, perhaps worry. If her husband is remembered as a rabbinic authority, she is remembered as the material condition of that authority's household. This is one of the most recurrent truths in pre-modern history. Learned male achievement often stood on female logistical labor that later narratives mention only in passing. Dulcia is unusual because the passing mention expanded into an elegy. And what of ordinary Ashkenazic women not memorialized in poetry? They likely baked, brewed, nursed, cleaned, negotiated with neighbors, tracked household assets, managed servants if they had them, helped raise children, and participated in credit networks at levels ranging from modest to substantial. Some endured abuse. Some were abandoned. Some became widows and had to survive by skill. Some inherited responsibilities no ideal text had planned for them. If sources sometimes speak of female modesty and domesticity, actual survival required competence. The medieval Jewish house in Northern Europe was therefore not an inactive enclosure. It was a workshop of religion, reproduction, finance, and adaptation under pressure. It held law books at one end and loan disputes at the other. It held Sabbath calm and anti-Jewish danger within the same week. It held love, loss, childbirth, and debt, and it held women at the center of those processes. When Dulcia's story ends, it ends violently, and that violence has too often overshadowed the life that preceded it. But if we resist letting martyrdom swallow biography, we see something more instructive. We see a woman whose private labor was inseparable from communal endurance. Is that not a better way to understand behind closed doors than the old fantasy of medieval passivity? The lamp in Worms burns lower. Outside, Christian Europe presses in with all its constraints, possibilities, and hatred. Inside, the house still functions because someone has kept it functioning. But farther south and west, in the multilingual worlds of medieval Iberia, this same household light would fall on women who moved among credit, medicine, poetry, domestic management, and law in ways that complicate any simple picture of seclusion. For our final chapter, let us enter a Jewish home in medieval Iberia. perhaps in Barcelona, Zaragoza, Toledo, or another urban center where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish worlds overlapped across centuries. Here I will begin with an illustrative woman, carefully framed as such. A Jewish widow in 14th century Barcelona lifts a small lamp and carries it from one room to another. In the front part of the house, a notarial acknowledgement of debt has been folded away. In the kitchen, food is nearly ready. A daughter has been learning stitches. On a shelf lie herbs from a healer's visit, or perhaps from the woman's own practice if she belongs to the minority of Jewish women known to medicine. The house is quiet for a moment, but only for a moment. Medieval Iberia offers another corrective to the simple notion that women's lives were hidden, static, or exclusively domestic. Research on Jewish women in Spain and the Crown of Aragon shows women appearing in economic records, wills, dowry disputes, credit relations, and communal care. Some Jewish women had their own incomes. Some participated in money lending or trade. Studies of Catalonia suggest that Jewish women could be active in public and economic life to a degree that surprises anyone who has accepted a purely cloistered model. Widows in particular could exercise substantial practical authority, though always within structures still marked by patriarchal law and communal expectation. The house remained crucial. That is one thread linking Iberia to all our earlier chapters, but the Iberian house was also more visibly entangled with documentary culture. Notarial societies produced records. Property, marriage portions, debt, inheritance, guardianship, and neighborhood relations could leave traces. Women appear not merely as objects passed through mail transactions, though that certainly happened, but sometimes as actors recognizable in those transactions. Their legal positioning was still uneven, often mediated through kinship and communal norms, yet the records preserve movement rather than stillness. This movement included work. Some Jewish women in medieval Spain engaged in commerce and credit. Others appear in relation to textile labor, household management, childcare, or charitable duties. In Aragon, records also preserve evidence of Jewish women involved in medicine. The fact that a handful of names survive does not tell us that women physicians were common, but it does shatter the assumption that Jewish female life in Iberia unfolded only between cradle and kitchen hearth. Even within the home, practical knowledge could be technical knowledge. How to treat bodies, preserve food, maintain linens, prepare for birth, or administer household assets. The lamp in this room also shines on language. Medieval Iberian Jewry moved through Hebrew, Arabic, Romance vernaculars, and later increasingly Christian notarial cultures. A woman need not be a literary prodigy to inhabit that multilingual environment. Documents might be explained orally. Terms might shift from room to street to court. Recipes, prayers, bargains, and family instructions moved in spoken channels, even when writing remained unevenly distributed. Behind closed doors, women were often custodians of continuity in the most literal sense. They kept patterns of speech, food, observance, and memory intact across change. And change came often. Muslim-ruled and Christian-ruled zones differed over time and place. Communal status shifted. Violence, taxation, and vulnerability could sharpen unexpectedly. Marriage connected households to broader strategies of protection and alliance. Women bore much of the everyday burden of translating instability into routine. A household could look settled while its future was anything but. Could a room like this be called private when law, market, medicine, and communal identity all passed through it? The answer, once again, is only partly. Privacy in the modern sense does not quite fit. The medieval Jewish home was intimate, yes, but also functional, legal, and exposed. Its door closed, but information, risk, and obligation kept flowing. A woman working inside it might prepare Sabbath food, manage a servant, reckon a loan, supervise a child's first training, receive or send a message, and think through a marriage arrangement all in a single day. If we insist on calling that only domestic, we reduce history to ignorance. Iberia also gives us especially useful reminders about disputed evidence. Take the famous archival reference from 14th century Zaragoza to a woman called Seti, sometimes glossed as a rabbis. Historians still debate exactly what that title meant. Did it indicate a female religious teacher, the wife of a rabbi, an honorific of status, or something else? The very debate is instructive. It shows both how alluring and how dangerous isolated references can be. We want dramatic breakthroughs. The archive usually gives us ambiguity instead. Th. Irresponsible historian does not flatten that ambiguity into certainty. Similarly, women's literary and cultural presence can be difficult to pin down. The Andalusi poet Casmuna is often invoked as a rare female poetic voice, yet scholars have debated details of her identity and context. Once again, the point is not to deny women's presence, but to treat the evidence carefully. Medieval Jewish women in Iberia clearly participated in economic, familial, and cultural life. The challenge is determining scale, norm, and local variation without turning each striking case into a universal rule. The lamp beside our illustrative widow helps us stay honest. It keeps our attention where the evidence is strongest, on the household as a center of action. Here women prepared for Sabbaths and festivals. Here they maintained foodways that bound families to law. Here they stitched, counted, soothed, and strategized. Here daughters learned skills that were both domestic and economic. Here illness was first observed. Here old women remembered what younger ones had not yet lived. Here migration, fear, and rumor were processed before they ever reached the synagogue or court. We should not romanticize this. Household centrality can coexist with heavy burden. The same woman who handles money may still lack full legal standing. The same mother who directs a room may still be vulnerable to abandonment, widowhood, or communal pressure. The same healer may still live at the mercy of unstable authorities. Agency in history is not the same thing as freedom. It is often the art of maneuvering within limits. Still, that maneuvering deserves to be seen clearly. Medieval Iberian Jewish women were not merely recipients of civilization. They were transmitters of it. They maintained observance in mixed societies. They sustained family memory. They participated in economies of credit and care. They stood at the point where minority life became durable in the face of change. When the public record notices them, it is often because something unusual happened, but the unusual survives atop the ordinary. Lamps had to be lit long before archives were made. And there is a final melancholy here. As the later Middle Ages deepened, Iberian Jewish life moved toward crisis. Rising pressures, waves of violence, conversion, fracture, and by 1492, expulsion from Spain. Not every Jewish household experienced these ruptures in the same way, and much of that later story reaches beyond tonight's medieval frame. But it matters to remember that the women who kept houses ordered were also the ones who had to make continuity portable when continuity was threatened. A tradition maintained in rooms could sometimes be carried when institutions fell. So our last lamp in Iberia glows in more than one direction. It looks backward to Tiberias, Babylonia, Fustat, and Worms, where women used household space to stabilize law, intimacy, and survival. It also looks forward to exile, adaptation, and the long afterlife of customs shaped in kitchens and bedrooms rather than courts alone. Historians still debate titles, representative cases, and the exact reach of women's public visibility, but the deeper pattern is unmistakable. Behind closed doors, Jewish women were not waiting for history to happen elsewhere. They were making the conditions under which history could go on. And after these Iberian rooms, the little household flame would travel further still, into new diasporas and new centuries, though tonight we will let it rest here for a while. Tonight we followed one small household lamp through late antique rabbinic Palestine, where women turned sacred time into practical routine inside homes shaped by purity law, marriage contracts, and male-authored ideals. Through Geonic Babylonia, where the lamp shone over the tightening logic of family law, divorce rulings, waiting periods, and the stubborn fact that domestic crises could force legal change. Through the Cairo Geniza world of medieval Egypt, where Wusha the broker, young brides, workers, teachers of sewing and spinning, and women living through divorce, travel, poverty, and kinship instability emerged from a rare documentary archive. Through medieval Ashkenaz, where Dulcia of Worms and many less famous women managed households that were also sites of credit, charity, child-rearing, ritual observance, and vulnerability in Christian Europe. And finally, through medieval Iberia, where Jewish women in cities such as Barcelona and Zaragoza moved among domestic management, credit, medicine, dowry, language, and community survival in societies that were never as neatly divided into private and public as later imagination likes to pretend. Across all 5 worlds, the lamp kept teaching the same lesson. The closed door of the Jewish home did not hide a blank space in history, but a dense one, full of counting, cooking, waiting, mending, teaching, bargaining, washing, comforting, fearing, praying, and preserving. If public history is often what gets written down first, private history is what makes the public possible. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson to fall asleep with tonight. Civilization is often sustained not by the loudest room, but by the room that stays lit longest. The lives most easily overlooked are often the lives that carried the heaviest continuity. And the quietest work, repeated across generations, may be the work that outlasts almost everything else. If you enjoyed this journey, do leave a like, subscribe for more slow history for sleep, and tell me which part stayed with you most tonight. Tiberias, Babylonia, Fustat, Worms, or Iberia. And if you feel like it, leave your location and local time again below. I truly love reading where the night finds you. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of history with me. Sleep well, stay warm, and I'll meet you again in the next soft pool of lamplight.